The following message is a presentation of Legonier Ministries, home of the radio program Renewing Your Mind with R.C. Sproul.
I think every person who's ever been married has some kind of humorous story to tell about their honeymoon. And I have one too. It wasn't funny to me at the time because my wife and I had gone together for 8 years and patiently waited the day of our wedding, which wedding was performed on June the 11th, 1960 in Pittsburgh, and it was in the afternoon. And after the wedding came an interminably long wedding reception where I shook hands with every person in the world, it seemed. And then after that, another reception at relatives' homes. And then after that, a long drive to the airport where we finally boarded a flight for New York City. And we were going to what was then Idlewild International Airport, now Kennedy International Airport. And we were going to spend the night there at a hotel and fly out the next morning for the destination of our honeymoon, which was Bermuda. Now, you know what it was like. Before you go on your honeymoon, you look at all the pictures and you read the brochures and you get some view of the enchantment that awaits you when you go on that honeymoon trip. And I could think of no more enchanting place in all the world to go than to Bermuda. So we were very, very excited about that. Well, we get to New York City, and the first problem was that actually we didn't land at Kennedy Airport. We landed at Newark Airport, and our hotel was at Kennedy Airport because we were going to fly from there in the morning. And we landed on a Saturday night, and the traffic was horrendous, and I spoke to a cab driver at the airport there at Newark, and I said, how long will it take us by cab at this hour to get over to Kennedy Airport? And he said, oh, in this traffic tonight, he said, it's liable to take an hour and a half. And I said, no way am I going to do that. So I went back into the airport and I went up to one of these little counters and I hired a private plane, a little 3-passenger type thing to fly us from Newark to Kennedy. And that was an adventure because the plane flew low over the skyline of New York, in between buildings and by the Empire State Building, all that. And that was neat. And in just a few moments, we were arriving at Kennedy Airport. Now the next thing was to get from the airport terminal to the hotel. And the pilot of this little plane told me, he said, when you get down on the ground, just go inside the terminal building, and they have these courtesy phones on the wall, and you call the hotel where you're staying, and they'll send a limousine to come and pick you up. And so that's what we did. I went over to the courtesy phone and called the hotel, and they said, yes, we have your reservations, Mr. Sproul. We'll be right over to pick you up. And so Vest and I went to the front of the terminal, took our suitcases there, and sat down on our suitcases and sat there for an hour and a half on our wedding night, waiting for this limousine that never came. It took me that long to realize that somehow they had forgotten us before I went and called back. And here they had come and picked somebody else up thinking that it was us. And we sat there in our suitcases on our wedding night for an hour and a half. Now, here's my question. What would you think of us if I would have said, we're having so much fun sitting here on our suitcases that I think we'll forget about our trip to Bermuda and cancel it? You would think I've lost my mind. And yet that is the way we behave all the time with respect to heaven. Jonathan Edwards once made the comment that no person who seeks to go on a pilgrimage to a glorious and exotic place will take up permanent residence at an inn along the way. It's nice to have the resting place along the way, but we're always moving toward that which is better. And he said that Christians who cling tenaciously to this world and to this life are like sojourners who get stuck in a wayside inn and lose sight of their glorious destination. See, we're headed for someplace far more glorious than Bermuda. We're headed for heaven. And what we need to understand is not only that there is such a heaven, but that this heavenly place is so vastly superior to anything that we experience in this world. Let me turn your attention for a moment to Paul's statements to the Philippian church that he gives in the first chapter of his letter to the Philippians. Keep in mind that Paul is nearing the end of his life, and that Paul is now shut up in prison. And he's struggling with the circumstances in which he finds himself. And in chapter 1, verse 19, he makes this statement: "For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed. But with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death." Do you hear what Paul is saying? I don't know what they're going to do with me. They may hack my body to pieces. They may chop off my head, which is what they did. But whether I live or whether I die, Christ is going to be magnified and honored in my body. And I can say that with boldness. He's speaking with confidence. But before I go on, let's ask the question, how could he face this kind of circumstance with such confidence and such serenity of heart and of spirit? Let's read on. "For to me, to live is Christ." Just stop right there. Paul says, for me to live is Christ. That's what my life is caught up in. Talk about a fanatic. Paul had one idea, one consuming passion: Christ. He was so focused on Christ that he said, for me to live is Christ. But what's the next part of the statement? And to die is gain. That's the four-letter word that he uses. G-A-I-N, gain. I enjoy fellowship with Christ right now. If I am alive, I am in Christ. For me to live is to enjoy this fellowship with Christ. And if I die, it's gain. Now, gain is an antonym for what word? Loss. Exactly. We have a tendency to look at death as not only a loss, but the worst of all possible losses. Now, it is a loss for us when we lose loved ones to death. But is it necessarily a loss for them? Not if they're destined for heaven. Let's look back and see what else Paul says. Verse 22 of chapter 1 of Philippians. "But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell. For I am hard-pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy of faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again." And from the record of history, it seems that Paul did survive this period of incarceration. This was not his final imprisonment, and that there was an extension of his earthly ministry so that he could fulfill this idea that he just announced to the Philippians. But you see the dilemma he expresses. I'm in a strait between two things. I'm betwixt and between. He's experienced a profound sense of ambivalence, a struggle within his heart in terms of his desires. He says, on the one hand, he sees that it's very pressingly urgent for the sake of his children in the faith for him to continue to live. And he wants to be of service to them. He knows that they need him. And he said, I'm in a strait between these two things, whether to stay and be with you, which is far more needful, or to depart and be with Christ. It's like Paul saying, hey, I love being with you folks. You're my children in the faith, you're my friends, you're my beloved. But when it comes down to being with you or being with Christ, it's no contest. He said, and so I'm torn between staying with you and leaving to depart and to be with Christ. And then he gives a little parenthesis. And in that parenthetic statement, he says what? Which is far better. To live is Christ, to die is gain. Paul doesn't just say that the difference here is between the good and the better. Nor does he say that it's the difference between the good and the best. But it's the difference between the good and the far better. Now the best is still beyond heaven, with the final consummation, with the resurrection of the body and so on. But even in the state we enter now at our death, the evaluation of the apostle is that it's not only a better situation than anything we enjoy in this world, but it is far better. What would that do to our lives and to our confidence and to the health of our souls, beloved, if we really believe that? A few months ago, I was preparing to make a trip where I had to speak at a conference. Everything was scheduled. There were people who had registered for that conference. There was no way I could arbitrarily cancel my presence at that conference. And the night before I was to leave, I received a phone call that informed me that my beloved mentor, Dr. John Gerstner, had collapsed in Pittsburgh while delivering a series of messages. And the message I got that night was that he was taken to the hospital in a coma, that he had had 3 strokes, and that he was now comatose and was not expected to live. And all of a sudden, I was shaken to my boots. Dr. Gerstner is elderly. He's had close encounters with death before. I've anticipated that at some point he will go home. And I've often wondered how I would feel if that word came to me that my beloved mentor had died. I know how I would feel. I would feel as a spiritual orphan. I would feel vulnerable. I would feel alone. I would feel threatened to not have his stabilizing influence in my life anymore, just as a son feels when their father is taken from them. And so I was very concerned in my soul, and I thought, first of all, mundane things. How in the world am I going to rearrange my schedule to go to this conference and get to the funeral in time if he should die in the next 48 hours? And then I began to think about how costly this would be for my own life and my soul to be without my mentor. And then finally, through the grace of God, I began to think of what it would mean for him. And I thought, wow, if Dr. Gerstner goes home now, say he goes this afternoon, my guess is tonight he'll be sitting at a table talking theology with Luther and Calvin and Augustine and Edwards. And for the first time in his entire life, he will be having a theological conversation with peers, because he's never had that privilege in this world. And I thought, what a glorious thing it would be for him when he crosses the threshold and enters into the heavenly sanctuary. A man whose indefatigable energy shames all of us. If I have to speak 4 times in a single day, I am spent and exhausted, and after I'm finished, I can't find myself able to do anything productive for the rest of the day. It taxes my energy level so greatly to speak. And yet I've watched Dr. Gerstner, when he was 75 years old, stand in front of a camera and deliver 12 consecutive lectures and then say, "Would you like more?" Tireless, relentless. And he does this day in and day out. And I say, how weary he must be. And for him to enter into his rest, into the presence of Christ, is not needful for me, but far better for him. And in that episode, I was experiencing the struggle, not for myself, about my own life, but about his life, that Paul was experiencing about Paul's own life. But we know the answer to his struggle. Christ said to Paul, "Not yet, Paul. You still have more work to do. The hour will come when you can come home. I've prepared a place for you. But right now your place is back in the ministry, back working in behalf of the people." And for a period of time, Paul had to live in a similar vein to that is told of the people in the Old Testament. In the 11th chapter of Hebrews, the famous roll call of the heroes of faith, the great faith chapter, where it talks about the faith of Abraham and of Isaac and Jacob, of Joseph and all the rest. And it talks about these people in antiquity who trusted God. And in verse 13 of chapter 11 of Hebrews, we read this: "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." The saints of the Old Testament looked beyond the grave. Even as Job, in the midst of his torment and suffering, said, "Though he slay me, yet will I serve him. For I know that my Goel, I know that my Redeemer lives, and I shall see him standing on that day." The Old Testament patriarch did not have the benefit of the historic record of the resurrection of Christ, or being able to study the words of Jesus as we are able to study them today. They had vague, shadowy hopes in the future promises of God. But on the basis of that, they withstood torture and persecution and hatred and pain and suffering unimaginable, because they sought a better country, a heavenly country. And they sought a city whose builder and maker is God, because they understood that to depart and enter into heaven is far better. I mentioned today the episode of Dr. Gerstner's collapse in Pittsburgh and falling into the coma, and the news that I received. The bulletin the next day was radically different. He woke up, and the damage was minimal. And 2 days later, he went home. And then a few weeks later, he resumed his ministry. And we got the same kind of delay that the Apostle Paul experienced in the New Testament. And Dr. Gerstner just simply has to wait longer to enter into his rest. But you know, we're told that there's every conceivable heartache and anguish that we experience in the vale of tears that we call life. I can remember talking with my grandmother when she was 88 years old. And a little tear formed on her eye, and she looked at me wistfully, and she said, I just don't understand why God won't take me home. I want to go. And as Kierkegaard said, one of the worst pains that we're ever called to endure is to want to die and not be allowed. We're not allowed to take our own lives, but to want to die in order to be freed from pain is one thing. But to want to pass across the veil to see the face of Christ is something else. Have you come to the place in your thinking where you understand that death is not tragic for the Christian, but that it is triumph, as it means crossing the threshold into glory?
For more information about Legonier Ministries, call 1-800-435-4343 or contact us on the web at legonier.org. That's LIGONIER.org. Or write P.O. Box 54, 7500, Orlando, Florida, 32854.